Hello, class. This is part two of research design topic, looking at design types. And so, in this kind of lecture, I just want to kind of briefly go into more depth in some of these designs that are utilized in both qualitative and quantitative methods of research. So, the first thing I want to kind of bring up is that although I'm selecting a few different design types, there are other design types that are covered in your text that might be beneficial for you to review if they closely resemble something that you might be utilizing in your proposal. So to get started, the first decision a researcher generally makes is to select an experimental or non-experimental design. This decision is based on the objects you are studying, as well as the resources available to the research. Another kind of big thing is really the design of your research question dictates some of this. The main difference in experimental and non-experimental is the area of control, where the experimental design requires control of these factors and non-experimental designs do not. So let's consider both of these in some more detail, that is, experimental and non-experimental. So firstly, the broad concepts of research designs, the experimental research design. We all know about the experimental group, that is, where treatments or resources are given and compared to some control group where there's no treatments being given. In an experimental design, assignments of experimental group and control groups are typically random, and that's important to understand, the randomization process. The investigator must also control extraneous factors, or factors that are outside of the immediate objects under study, or factors under study that can influence outcomes. If these conditions are not controlled, internal validity is compromised. An example would be, let's say, in a health science laboratory where they're trying to study the relationship between, let's say, cancer cells and potential curative agent. Okay, the researchers kind of must control for the variation in temperature, humidity, and a number of additional factors that they aren't necessarily studying per se. They are studying the effect of the agent on the cancer cells, but they must remain mindful of these extra variables or extra factors as an issue in nature, so they can, or excuse me, at issue in nature, so they can, excuse me, I'm trying to figure out what I'm trying to say here. So their cure might have a change of working under general conditions. So what I'm trying to say is these extraneous variables could impact what it is they're really studying, and that is the cure. So when properly conducted with accurate controls, one could argue that the experimental design is the only means to establish true causality. So here, causality is defined as truly exploratory in nature, insofar as it is sufficiently controls for environmental factors that can narrowly focus on objects being studied, ruling out any manipulating additional factors or effects beyond those of immediate relevance to the experiment. That might sound complex, but the big thing to remember is what I'm trying to convey here is that in order to generalize the results, these extraneous variables need to be accounted for in experimental designs, which is key. So in non-experimental designs, because laboratories are not always available to researchers, particularly in social sciences, some non-experimental designs are more practical. Aside from the difficulty of examining, social, political, and economic phenomena in a laboratory, the use of non-experimental designs is often justified by the desire of the researchers to study kind of these aggregates like nations, cities, interest groups, those types of kind of phenomena. The non-experimental design is characterized by at least one of the following. A, presence of like a single group, so there's no separation of control or experimental groups. B, that could be a lack of control of the application of an experiment, or the independent variable, that is. Or C, an inability to measure the dependent variable before and after exposure to some independent variable. There are many important non-experimental methods to consider employing in your research designs. They include, like we briefly brought up, the histograph in the last lecture. They could also be cross-sectional research, case studies, descriptive research, survey research, even interviewing focus group research designs, as well as correlational research. For now, it'll suffice to the point that each of these kind of domains lack the presence of controls required to conduct the experimental research. So for the reasons noted above, social science, as kind of opposed to natural sciences, often employ these non-experimental designs. These can be called inferential research designs because the investigator will likely have to infer causality from observed relationships. Unlike experimental designs where establishing true causality is possible. We typically do not know if causality exists between or because of the lack of controlled environment. Thus, it is very important to introduce control variables to reduce error, but not remove it given the limitations of a non-experimental approach, and we don't want to necessarily avoid this in our conclusions. So research designs in the non-experimental area range from, like I kind of said, cross-sectional, which is more of a quantitative design, to the qualitative design, such as a case study. The cross-sectional design, as well as other quantitative designs, employs data and statistical analysis. The case studies, as well as kind of ethnographs and historical research, are qualitative and require more assessment from the research themselves, where quantitative research typically places more emphasis on the data. So let's look at design types. Quantitative designs. We already brought up cross-sectional. Well, cross-sectional research designs are often referred to as correlational analysis. This design analyzes observations from a sample or a cross-section of a population made at one point in time. Often this design relies on survey research or the data that results from survey research. Okay, so that's one type of design. And then let's look at, say, a longitudinal design, which employs similar approaches as the cross-sectional design, that correlation and regression, which are more of the statistical design terms, but involves the collection of data at different points in time. So this approach is used to test changes in behavior in one group of subjects at more than one point in time, such as the opinions of, 18 to 24-year-olds on war from pre-World I to pre-World II and pre-Vietnam periods. So you can see there what we're looking at and we're testing, and I should really say collecting, is these opinions at different points in time as they relate to war. Okay? So another design would be time series and interrupted time series, which measures positions on a dependent variable or several occasions prior to the introduction of some independent variable. And then we measure positions on the dependent variable after the introduction of that variable. And so it's kind of like getting a baseline, then adding in a variable, and then assessing. An important consideration for non-experimental designs is choosing the appropriate time frame for this study. So like in the natural sciences where experimental designs are most frequently used, an appropriate time-specific design is the pre-test, post-test approach, where researchers look for changes and observe behavior from pre to post test periods. This is also very common in social sciences. A typical approach where an agent or experimental factor is delivered at a specific time and post-test observations, or that is observations made after the experimental factor has been delivered, are compared with a pre-test observation, those before any test or experiment was introduced. So in the social science, this is an excellent design for studying the impact of public policies such as drug education programs, welfare reform programs, but it is not always possible to develop a pure experimental design in the social sciences because of the difficulty of controlling for the wide range of phenomena in society. So here society relates to the world outside the laboratory. So imagine controlling for individual experiences of survey respondents. This can be done at the kind of the margins, so meaning the factors the researcher is focused on, but not for the entire range of related experiences that might impact observations. For instance, a person's view of the death penalty, or the role of the government, or physician-assisted suicide, or a city's crime rate. All of these things can directly impact the observations. So now let's look at, say, quasi-experimental. So these are kind of a mixed design in some regards between experimental and non-experimental. So quasi-experimental designs help to overcome the difficulty or this impossibility in the social sciences of assigning control and experimental groups. Often this is a matter of pure cost, but it can be a function of the inability to actually control these outside lab settings. As a result, researchers often use this quasi-experimental design approach, kind of the best of both worlds. This approach, though, suffers from the lack of randomly assigned control in experimental groups, which is so important. However, it does provide researchers with an important comparison between individuals or communities that have already had the treatment, i.e. kind of this introduction of a new welfare policy to combat poverty, or the construction of some, say, new institutional procedure like a drug court to serve as an alternative to existing practices. Those could be examples where things have already kind of been grouped, if you will. And those individuals or communities that have not had the treatment, so those in the community that maybe haven't had exposure to these welfare policies or drug institutions, for example. The group that has experienced the new process or program is the quasi-experimental group. And the group without access to the process or kind of program is the quasi-control group. So once again, we're still getting some elements of experimental control group design in this quasi-experimental approach. This approach does work quite well in social science research, where the large amount of resources necessary to test a new program on an entire city or state or school, for that matter, are just simply not available. Another justification for employing a quasi-experimental design is that we cannot randomize the treatment and control groups, or would not want to if we could, for that matter. Consider a control group, consider a study of the impact of cigarette smoking has on lung cancer, or a study of the impact that free needle programs, say, have on heroin users, on AIDS and Hep B transmission. Neither of these studies would be justified if we were to ask some members of the community to smoke for our study or to use heroin. Both have important public health and public policy implications and should be studied. But ethically, it's not necessarily feasible to require that or to design our study as such. The quasi-experimental design gives us the capacity to carefully study these programs and consequences, including the poverty, say, and drug court examples above, without worsening the human condition or creating too much cost for human subjects. Okay? So that's kind of quasi-experimental designs in a nutshell. Panel studies, they examine the same group of people over several incidences of analysis. So this is often used to pursue public opinion research or other types of interview-centered designs. Through the panel study design, we can establish trends, which is, say, particularly useful in studies of candidate. If you think of the presidential candidacy, candidate saliency, and more generally public opinion. Here we can use the panel study to find out how a candidate or issue fares with the same group of respondents over time, and specifically different periods of time. This can also kind of be done with cohort studies, which focus on specific subpopulations without trafficking the same respondents. An example of a cohort design would be to interview, let's go with those 18 to 24-year-olds again, several times over the course of one time or more time periods to see how their opinions change. So that's panel studies can be a little bit more difficult in explaining, but I guess what's important to remember is the simplicity in them is that really they are interview-centered designs looking at different periods of time, really. So those kind of, in a nutshell, are just a few quantitative design types that I selected to kind of go over. Now I kind of want to go over some qualitative designs in a little bit more depth. So what follows is really a brief sense of some of the major qualitative designs as you kind of saw us go over these quantitative designs previously. I would encourage you to take time to learn about these and also to begin thinking about which designs, qualitative or quantitative, might work well for your proposal for this class. But let's first look at a case study, which is very common. The case study design is one of the more prominent qualitative research designs. This approach produces a non-generalizable look at the details of a phenomenon in practice. So giving the researcher and community a more detailed look at relevant factors that can typically be addressed through quantitative research. So you're adding a more experiential knowledge to kind of those facts and figures that are generally given through quantitative. The benefit of this research is a careful look at the object or factor being studied in its natural or actual setting. The cost is that the case study typically does not produce general knowledge that can be applied to other or even similar contexts because it is so case study specific. Okay, so another important method of evaluating real world context is a focus group research or elite interviewing. These techniques can provide powerful insights into the mechanics of just casual relationships and help the researcher learn from practitioners and client groups about the details of programs and practices to further kind of understand the variables under study. Both of these techniques also apply to kind of the facilitation of facilitating public meetings and other decision-making tools that involve the input of people in the field. So let's say, in focus group research, it's important to give participants a voice in what is said and how it is said. In an academic sense, the goal of a focus group is to gain access to kind of private, non-communicable, unconscious feelings and emotions. So in a real sense, a focus group research is direct, sensitive, and interactive method of assessing public opinion and accomplishing what telephone studies cannot really. It approaches attitudes and priorities that allow respondents to talk freely and to choose descriptive categories significant to them. So let's look at ethnographic studies, which is also very popular. Ethnograph is the process of describing a culture or a way of life from from a person's point of view. Another name for it is kind of field research. The focal point of view is the idea of a universe in a kind of this dewdrop. Each person a reflection of their culture, and all that is their gestures, displays, symbols, songs, sayings, everything that has some implicit meaning for others in that culture. It's the job of this ethno-design to establish the hidden inferences that distinguish, for example, a wink and a nod in any given culture. Numerous funding opportunities exist both abroad and domestically for this type of research. If you think just simply that we live in a global world, this type of design is critical in understanding the world in which we all live in. So the ethnographic method involves observation and note-taking. Often it's used by kind of anthropologists that are trying to get a thick description of what it is that's going around in the world. One of the assumptions, though, of ethnographic designs is this naturalism, or leaving natural phenomena alone. In essence, the researcher tries to be invisible. There are a variety of ways the researcher develops trust and rapport with the group in order to do this, and to watch and listen carefully without being noticed. So in some regards, you're really reporting on observations and using that to fuel your results. Another type of research design is in qualitative is this historiography. Oh God, that sounds horrible. Another tough word. Which is the method of doing historical research or gathering and analyzing historical evidence. There are 4 types of historical evidence: primary sources, secondary sources, running records, and recollections. This method is really commonly employed by historians that mostly rely on primary sources for the use of archival data. Secondary sources are the work of many historians as well in writing history. Running records are simply documentaries maintained by a kind of organizations or private, non-private organizations. And recollections would be more of autobiographic or graphics, memoirs, oral histories, things of that nature. So historiography isn't necessarily commonly employed in social sciences, but it's something to be aware of, that as you're going through this research design process, this happens to be one of the qualitative methods. Another one is this participant observation design, which these designs rely on the process of immersing yourself in the study of the people you're kind of not too different from. It is almost always done covertly, with the researcher never revealing their true purpose or identity. It's kind of going undercover. If it's a group you already know a lot about, you need to kind of step back and take a perspective of kind of like a Martian, as if you came to a different planet and were seeing things through kind of this fresh light. It's more of a secretive kind of style of research, and more localized, but it is also a design that is utilized in quantitative or qualitative methods. And then briefly, I also want to just bring up probably one of the more common methods that I think many of your proposals would probably fall under, at least the qualitative proposals. This idea of phenomenology is also research design. And in this type of research design, you're really trying to capture the lived experiences of some group. For example, I've done a study looking at counselors' experiences working with male sexual assault survivors. In this case, I'm using the method of interviewing and open questions and to develop a qualitative understanding of counselors' experiences working with men who survived sexual assault. I'm not asking or trying to report any specific variables as they relate to quantitative measures. I'm really trying to capture the essence of these counselors' experiences. So that would fall more under this phenomenological research design under the qualitative umbrella. Another example might be the grounded theory, which I also encourage you to review. Grounded theory would be much more about looking at what exists and then trying to develop some theoretical explanation for why that might be the case. Now, obviously, really any of the qualitative methods are generalizable. And they're always kind of subject to that specific group that you're looking at, you're talking to, you're communicating with, you're observing. But it provides, all of these methods in qualitative provide valuable information for quantitative methods. It gives us more supportive rationale. So both types of designs, these experimental, non-experimental, qualitative, quantitative designs, are important in kind of facilitating each other's understanding of these broader concepts. What I'd strongly encourage you to do is look at what your research question is, what the literature looks like that you've already found related to your topic, what methods have been utilized, and what makes the most sense in what you're trying to uncover. If you're trying to uncover more of the experiential ideas that necessarily you're not generalizing, maybe a qualitative, non-experimental in some regards method would be better. If you're really trying to provide kind of a statistical analysis and an explanation that can be generalized and maybe more broadly utilized, maybe a qualitative design with surveys, assessments, things like that would be more important for you to utilize in your research. So I know this can be very complex and very difficult in some regards in understanding, but the big thing I want you to have is an understanding of these terms, being exposed to them, and understanding that there is this kind of separation between the two research design types, qualitative, quantitative, and then underneath that, kind of these experimental, non-experimental design approaches that come in many different forms. So I'm hoping that just through listening to some of these lectures that you will be able to start, at a bare minimum, having a little bit more of an understanding of something is the easiest way of putting it. And although they might not always directly relate to what's being covered at the moment, they will always be supplementary information that will hopefully give you some more clarity. Until next week, thank you.